December 22nd, 1908, Estero, Florida, cypress swamps, the Gulf Coast in the middle of nowhere. Inside a small building on the grounds of a utopian commune, a group of people are gathered to watch someone in a bathtub. In the bathtub was a man. He's been there for 3 days. His name is Cyrus Reed Teed, and the people standing around him aren't grieving. They're not planning a funeral or calling a doctor. They're just waiting, because Cyrus Teed told them that he wouldn't die. He told them that he was immortal, that when his body finally gave out, it would only be temporary, that he would rise again. He even told them when. Christmas morning. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. These weren't uneducated people. They weren't isolated backwoods fanatics. Teed's followers included lawyers, engineers, and teachers, women who left their wealthy husbands to join him, men who sold everything they owned. They built roads, a printing press, a sawmill, and a general store. They built a fully working commune on the Florida coast. And in December of 1908, they're standing around that bathtub waiting for a dead man to wake up. 2 physicians were called, Doctors Hansen and Brecht. They arrived 24 hours after Teed already died. They were informed, and I'm pulling this from the Fort Myers press, that Dr. Teed wasn't dead, that he was simply, quote, in a trance from which he would emerge at the proper time. The physicians examined him, and they declared him dead beyond doubt. The followers didn't move. Christmas came and went, still nothing. The Lee County health inspector eventually had to issue a formal order demanding that the body be surrendered for burial. The commune's written response, and this document exists, it insists that Teed is in a state of transition. Not death, transition. The standoff ended when the body began to decompose so badly it went beyond argument. That's where the story ends, but it's far from where the story begins. So how did dozens of rational people end up standing around a bathtub in a Florida swamp waiting for a resurrection? To find this out, we need to go back almost 40 years. 1869, upstate New York, a farmhouse, a small laboratory, and a man who claimed that God appeared to him in a blinding light and told him that everything he thought he knew about the planet he was walking on was wrong. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. This is the story of the self-proclaimed Messiah, Cyrus Reed Teed. Let's start out with who Cyrus Teed was before any of this, because the man who ends up in the bathtub in 1908, the man his followers refused to bury, he doesn't start as a messiah, he starts as a farm boy. Cyrus Reed Teed was born 1839, Trout Creek, New York, upstate. His father was a Baptist preacher, and his childhood was unremarkable. He served briefly in the Civil War. He came home, studied what he called eclectic medicine. It's a 19th century practice that blended herbal remedies with conventional treatment. He opened a small practice in Utica, New York. Then comes 1869. Teed later wrote that one evening, while alone in his laboratory, something happened. A blinding light appeared. In that light was a female divine presence. He described her as the embodiment of God in feminine form. And she told him things. She told him the nature of the universe, the nature of God, and then the part that changes everything. She told him who he was. And he wasn't just some physician in upstate New York. He was Cyrus, the Anointed, the Redeemer, the same figure named in Scripture in the book of Isaiah. Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, is called by name by God himself, the only non-Jewish figure in the entire Old Testament given that designation. And the Hebrew form of Cyrus? Koresh. From that night forward, he began signing his name that way. Koresh, not Cyrus Teed, and Koresh had a mission. But here's what separates Teed from every other 19th century self-declared messiah, and there are more than you'd think. Here's what makes him genuinely different. He didn't just claim divine revelation, he claimed scientific proof. Teed became convinced through his illumination and through subsequent study that everything modern science said about the structure of the earth was wrong. And I'm not talking slightly wrong. He was talking about seriously fundamental understanding of our world completely backwards and wrong. We don't live on the outside of a globe, he said. We live on the inside. Picture an eggshell, 100 miles thick. The surface we walk on is the interior of the surface of that shell. The sky above us isn't infinite space. It's the hollow center of the sphere. Now, the sun, that means, isn't 93 million miles away. According to Teed, the sun is the central mechanism inside the cavity. It's a rotating electromagnetic battery, roughly 25 miles in circumference. And the stars aren't other suns light years away. They're optical reflections on the outside surface of the globe. I want to be careful here because it's easy to laugh at this, and the newspapers of the time certainly did, But Teed wasn't presenting this as blind faith. He was presenting it as science. He wrote papers. He developed something called Koreshan cosmogony. It's a complete alternative physics, and he made a claim that most religious leaders would never dare make. He said, "Prove me wrong." He said he'd submit his theory to physical, measurable geodetic testing on the actual surface of the Earth, and the results, he insisted, would speak for themselves. We're going to come back to that test because it actually happened, and when it did, it made national news. But first, he needs followers. He knows exactly where to find them. Chicago, 1880s, the fastest growing city in the world. 2 million people packed into a city that didn't exist 50 years earlier. It's loud, crowded, and hungry for meaning. Labor unrest, economic panic, the aftermath of the Haymarket affair. People are desperate for something that makes sense in the world. Now, Teed arrives and begins preaching. He's, by every account, even hostile ones, a compelling speaker. He's patient, methodical. He didn't rant. He explained, drew diagrams, answered questions. He established what he called the College of Life in a neighborhood called Normal Park on the city's south side. And people came. Educated people, professional people, women in particular, came in significant numbers because Koreshanity, his college, offered something almost no institution in 1880s America offered women: authority. Teed gave women leadership roles inside the unity. He preached equality of the sexes. At its peak, the Chicago organization reportedly numbered in the thousands. The Flaming Sword, his commune's own newspaper, which he published himself, had subscribers across the country. But Chicago is also where the first serious trouble finds him, because not everybody who walked through the doors of the College of Life walked out a believer. In the Chicago Times, and I have the article, there's a story that tells you exactly what kind of man Cyrus Teed could be when the cameras weren't on him, so to speak. A man named Sidney C. Miller, his young wife, described in the article as a woman of voluptuous figure and a pretty face, well-fitted to play sweet music on his golden harp, had been, in Miller's words, induced to enter Teed's, quote, earthly harem. Now, Miller sued $100,000 in damages. His attorney, W.H. Hill, told the press, "This suit is but the beginning. There will be several other similar actions started in a few weeks." A criminal prosecution was also threatened. Teed was never convicted of anything. The case didn't destroy him, but the pattern it describes, the control over women, the devotion extracted, the legal and personal entanglement, that pattern is going to follow him all the way to Florida, the Sunshine State. By the early 1890s, Teed started to think beyond Chicago. Chicago is a base, but what he wants, what the Illumination demands, is something larger, a city, and not just a commune, an entire new city built from the ground up, built on the principles of Koreshan cosmogony, a new Jerusalem. Teed published the blueprints, and he announced it would eventually house 10 million people. 10 million. He just needs the land. And in 1893, a follower tells him about a stretch of wilderness on the southwest coast of Florida, a river called the Estero. Cypress trees, Gulf access, virtually uninhabited. Teed goes to see it, and the moment he does, he knows. This is where his new civilization begins. Estero, Florida, 1894. It's not the same place it is now. Now it's a state park with a gift shop and a walking trail. But what it was, now that's a different story. Mangrove tangles, mosquitoes, a river so shallow in places you could wade across it. And the nearest real town, Fort Myers, was around 12 miles away and barely qualified as a town. Now, there were no real roads, no telegraph lines, nothing. This is where Cyrus Teed decided to build the greatest city in human history. He purchased the land on the Estero River. He started bringing followers down from Chicago. They came with tools, their entire savings. His followers cleared the cypress and dug irrigation channels by hand. They built a bakery, a machine shop, a printing press, because Teed never stopped publishing. They even built a 300-seat auditorium for lectures. Now, a visitor in 1900 described the settlement as genuinely impressive. It was organized and clean, and the people working it were described as industrious and committed. From the outside, if you didn't know what they believed, it looked like a serious enterprise. And Teed was serious. He wasn't playing community theater. He had a blueprint, a literal architectural blueprint for the New Jerusalem. The published plans called for a city of 10 million residents laid out in concentric circles. He named the streets and designed the districts. The Koreshan Unity's own newspaper ran the designs. Teed wasn't building a commune. He was building the capital of a new civilization. But he had a problem, and the problem was credibility. Teed could attract followers, he could preach, and we know he could publish, but his hollow earth claim, the scientific foundation of everything, that claim needed more than just his word. Evidence the outside world couldn't dismiss would do, so he decided to get it. In the fall of 1896, Teed organized what he called a geodetic survey. It's a formal, physical, measurable experiment. It's conducted on the beach at Naples, Florida, on a flat margin of the Gulf of Mexico, as level a surface as you can find in the natural world. The instrument they used was called the rectilineator. This is genuinely ingenious, even if the conclusion was wrong. The rectilineator was built by one of Teed's followers, a professor named Ulysses Grant Morrow. It was a series of precision-machined mahogany and brass cross-sections, each one carefully leveled, each one connected to the next to extend a perfectly horizontal line across the surface of the water. Now, the logic was this. If the Earth was convex, as conventional science says, then a perfectly straight horizontal line extended over the water would appear to curve upward over distance. The water would seem to drop away beneath it. But if the Earth is concave, if we live on the inside of a sphere, then the line would appear to curve downward. The water would seem to rise to meet it. Got that? The survey team spent months on the beach, adjusting, measuring, recording. Their conclusion, published in the Flaming Sword and repeated in papers as far away as Chicago and New York, was that the line curved downward. The Earth, they announced, was proven concave. Now, the scientific community wasn't impressed. Critics pointed out that the machine had no independent verification, that Morrow, the instrument's inventor, was also the one conducting the survey, that the methodology assumed what it was trying to prove. So, it may not have been good science. The Fort Myers Press noted that if Teed's conclusions were correct, there would be what was called a complete revolution in the laws of physics. But here's the thing. Teed didn't need to convince physicists, he needed to convince people. And people were watching. The national press covered the survey, not charitably, but they covered it. The Chicago Herald, papers in Baltimore and New York, the Daily Miami Metropolis. Reporters described Teed's theories in detail. They called him a crank and a fraud. They called him dangerous, but they kept writing about him. And in Tampa, where Teed went to lecture at the Tampa Bay Casino, he gave what I think is the single most revealing performance of his life. The room held around 150 people. Teed delivered his standard lecture, The Hollow Earth and the Rectilineator, The Proof. When he finished, a man in the audience stood up, the street corner evangelist named Reverend W.C. Cuddy. And Cuddy asked a question that cut straight to the center of everything. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, "Doctor, the sun is estimated at 2.5 million miles in circumference. How can a sun that size fit inside a hollow sphere of only 8,000 miles in diameter?" It's a good question. The room went quiet. Teed answered immediately, what the newspapers describes as the most confident, or rather positive manner. He said, "The sun is only 25 miles in circumference." 25 miles, not 2.5 million. Cuddy and Teed went back and forth for 3/4 of an hour. The crowd watched. The evangelist challenged him on scripture, science, and basic mathematics. Teed answered every question. He never flinched or lost his composure. And at the end, Cuddy challenged Teed to a joint public debate on the second coming of Christ. But Teed declined. He said he'd debate any scientist or astronomer or learned religious man, but he'd not lower himself to debate a street corner evangelist. Cuddy pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. He said God just inspired him to write a poem. He read it aloud to the audience. Cyrus Teed came riding on the devil's steed, sowing tares, the devil's weed. If on this trash your soul should feed, you'll land in hell with all his breed. The newspaper's final line about that evening is extraordinary. It reported that the audience, quote, though evidently not followers of Teed's theories, was much impressed with the doctor's earnest and thoughtful exposition of his belief. So the audience didn't believe him, but they were impressed anyway. That's the power of Cyrus Teed. That's what 150 strangers in a Tampa casino saw, what thousands of people in Chicago experienced. He wasn't a raving lunatic or speaking in tongues. He was calm and systematic. He had charts and measurements, and he had absolute unshakable certainty. Now back in Estero, the commune is growing. More followers arriving from Chicago, more buildings going up. The printing press is running, the New Jerusalem rising, slowly but rising. But Teed isn't satisfied with the colony. He never was. He wants something the state of Florida will have to recognize, something with legal standing, a charter with officers and votes. He wants a real town. And to get one, he's going to need to outmaneuver people who don't want to give him one, like the orange growers, landowners, the Fort Myers Press, and eventually the mayor and the marshal of Fort Myers themselves. By 1900, Estero was real. It's a functioning settlement with buildings, crops, industry, a newspaper, a community of true believers who'd given everything they owned to this place. But Teed has a problem that no amount of faith can solve: land. The Koreshans didn't own all the territory surrounding their settlement. Local landowners, orange growers, cattle ranchers, established Florida families held parcels adjacent to and inside what Teed considered his domain. And those neighbors were watching the growing commune with deep suspicion. And they had reason to, because what Teed wanted wasn't coexistence. He wanted to control, and he figured out exactly how he could do it legally. September 1st, 1904, Estero, Florida is incorporated as a municipality under the laws of the state of Florida. Teed engineered it. His followers held the convention and voted. They elected officers and filed paperwork overnight, and with that, the religious commune became a chartered American town, complete with a mayor, a marshal, and a town council. The seal of the new town was designed personally by Teed. It featured a representation of a swan, symbolizing his cosmology and immortality. The Fort Myers paper wasn't amused. The paper had been covering the Koreshans for years, skeptically. But the incorporation changed the tone entirely, because now this wasn't a religious curiosity. This was a political entity with legal powers over land and roads, over the Estero River itself, which was the only navigable route in or out for the surrounding farmers. The press wrote directly that the incorporation was designed to give the Koreshans control over the river. Now that, in their words, would deprive local residents of what they believed to be their public rights. Teed responded in print. He always responded in print. His letter to the press, published in the September 8, 1904 edition, is the masterclass in controlled outrage. He writes that the incorporation isn't a money-making scheme, and it's not a conspiracy. The Koreshans are law-abiding citizens who took legal action available to any group of residents under Florida law. And then, in the same letter, he writes this: "We will not interfere with any man's ideas or beliefs, and the press will for all time be on the side of those who will endeavor to work their chicanery and rapacity on our people." Chicanery and rapacity. This is how Cyrus Teed talks about his neighbors, the people he's supposed to be governing. But here's where it gets interesting, because Koreshans weren't just playing defense. They had an offensive strategy, and the Fort Myers press saw it clearly. They named it plainly. May 31st, 1900, 4 years before the incorporation, the paper already put it in writing. What is their aim in politics? They desire the political control of Lee County. So not just Estero, not just their commune. They wanted Lee County. In 1906, the Koreshans made their move. They organized a political party. They named it the Progressive Liberty Party and ran a full slate: representatives, treasurer, assessor, collector, 3 county commissioners, 3 school board members, every significant office in Lee County on one ticket, controlled by one man. The local Democratic Party, which ran everything in Lee County at the time, responded with alarm. An editorial in the press called the Progressive Liberty Party a vehicle for Koreshan control dressed up in high-sounding language. It warned every Democrat in the country to get to the polls and, quote, bury the lesson of Teedism so deep it will cease to influence in Lee County. And there's another dimension to this that the papers note but didn't fully explain. The Koreshan unity was also at this point in a complicated financial relationship with the merchants of Fort Myers. According to the press, the unity owed the town's merchants somewhere in the range of $2,000. The merchants needed the money, and the Koreshans knew it. The paper put it bluntly: the merchants were caught between the money they were owed and the candidate that they were being asked to endorse. Now that's leverage. It's calculated, deliberate leverage. Now, this is the part of the Koreshan story that gets lost when people only talk about the hollow earth theory. What Teed built in Florida wasn't just a spiritual community. It was a political operation. It had newspaper for propaganda, a municipality for legal cover, and a party for electoral power, and debt as a financial weapon. And standing at the center of it all, signing letters, publishing ultimatums, running candidates, was a man who also claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. The local press had a name for him by this point: Bombastes Koresh. It was a reference to a famous comic opera character, a blustering, pompous figure who makes enormous threats and delivers nothing. The people of Fort Myers were about to find out whether that nickname was accurate, because in the summer of 1906, while his political candidates were campaigning across Lee County, Cyrus Teed walked into Fort Myers, and he was looking for a fight. October 1906, Fort Myers, Florida. Teed and a group of his followers came to town. Their stated purpose was a public meeting. But what happened next depends entirely on who you ask. The extraordinary thing about this story, the reason it belongs on this channel, is that we don't have to guess. We have the documents, sworn documents filed with the county. They're signed and sealed before a notary public. We know exactly what happened. The Koreshan version, published in their own paper, the American Eagle, claimed that Teed and his followers were set upon by the town marshal, Saul W. Sanchez, and his men. It was unprovoked. That citizens of Estero were attacked in the streets of Fort Myers while officials looked the other way and even participated. Teed was struck, his glasses were knocked off his face, he was injured. Within days, he issued a formal response to the town of Fort Myers. The Fort Myers Press ran the headline on their front page. Bombastes Teed's Ultimatum. Now that nickname, Bombastes, the editor of the press decided, and they weren't subtle about it. The ultimatum itself was extraordinary, though. Teed demanded the following: the immediate removal of Marshal Sanchez from office, his placement under bond to keep the peace, a formal investigation into the moral character of town officials, the return of $30 penalty that was assigned against him and against the Koreshans, and finally reimbursement for his broken eyeglasses. And then came the threat. Teed closed his ultimatum with a warning. He would withdraw Koreshan Unity's business from Fort Myers entirely. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, he claimed, flowing out of the local economy. The final line: we demand them or the consequences of Fort Myers as a winter resort. He threatened to destroy the winter tourism economy of Fort Myers over a pair of eyeglasses. The town, for its part, didn't give in. Fort Myers responded on multiple fronts simultaneously, and they produced one of the most remarkable collections of primary source documents I've encountered covering the story. Now first, the Fort Myers Town Council convened a special meeting on October 27th of 1906. They passed a formal resolution. It's in the public record. It states, whereas Cyrus R. Teed has made repeated false statements in reference to the street brawl started by himself, and further, that it was evident to our minds that the aforesaid Teed came to Fort Myers looking for trouble. The resolution was signed by Chairman W.H. Towles and attested to by Clerk T.H. Levins. Second, Mayor Henry A. Hendry and Marshal Saul W. Sanchez appeared before a notary public. They filed a sworn affidavit, signed, sealed, and dated October 24th, 1906, notarized by Frank C. Alderman, Notary Public. The affidavit states as eyewitnesses that Cyrus R. Teed, known as Koresh, was the aggressor and deliberately sought an affray which would not have occurred had Koresh not been present. And then this line, that Koresh, under the circumstances, should, quote, congratulate himself that the matter was settled by Koresh and his followers, allowing their bonds to be forfeited to the town instead of appearing for trial, as they certainly would have done had their cause been on the right side of the Jordan. So the mayor of Fort Myers, in a sworn legal document, told Cyrus Teed, a man who claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, that his cause wasn't on the right side of the Jordan. The press also published an additional response, a formal piece under the headline, No Stormy Winter, making the case that Teed's economic threat was hollow, that Fort Myers didn't need Koreshan Unity's business, that the town's reputation as a winter resort was built on decades of goodwill, not on the patronage of one man's commune 12 miles down the river. Teed lost this fight, publicly, demonstrably, and on the record. But here's what the press seemed to miss. None of this stopped him. He went back to Estero. He kept publishing, kept preaching. His followers didn't leave, and the Progressive Liberty Party candidates were still on the ballot. Now, Teed, the man who'd just been publicly humiliated by the mayor, the marshal, the town council, and the county newspaper, started talking about his health. He was injured in the confrontation. The exact nature of those injuries were disputed, but the Koreshans called it a beating. Fort Myers called it a scuffle he started. Either way, something was wrong. People close to him noticed. He was declining. 2 years later, December 1908, Cyrus Reed Teed was dead, and his followers didn't give up on him yet. Before we get to December 1908, before the bathtub, before the vigil, there's something I haven't told you yet. Something that changes what that scene actually means. You've been picturing a group of grieving people in denial. Followers who loved their leader so much that they couldn't accept the fact that he was gone. A sad, deluded vigil. But that's not what it was. We need to understand a word Teed used, a specific technical word from his theology. Theocrasis. Teed didn't teach that he simply rise from the dead the way a conventional Christian might imagine resurrection. That was too small and too ordinary. He taught that at the moment of his death, his spirit would dematerialize physically and completely. It would pass or enter directly into the body of Victoria Gracia. Once inside her, the two of them would fuse, and not metaphorically, I'm talking literally. They'd become what Teed called a biune god, simultaneously masculine and feminine, a single divine being inhabiting one body. And at that moment, the moment of theocrasis, every follower in the Koreshan unity would also transform. They too would become immortal biune beings. The entire community would transcend physical death simultaneously. This is what they were waiting for in that room. Not really a resurrection, more of a transfiguration of every person present. Now, where does this idea come from? Because it didn't appear out of nowhere. Go back to 1869, the illumination, the blinding light in the laboratory, and the female divine presence. Teed's theology held that God wasn't masculine. Definitely not the stern patriarchal God of conventional 19th century Catholicism. God in Teed's system was biune, simultaneously and equally masculine and feminine. Now, the feminine aspect of the divine has been suppressed, distorted, and erased by centuries of institutional Christianity. The female presence in his illumination wasn't a vision or a metaphor. It was God showing him her true face. This is also why the hollow earth wasn't separate from the religion. In Teed's system, the cosmology and the theology were the same thing. The structure of the universe was the structure of God. A closed sphere containing everything within itself, self-sufficient, complete, was the physical expression of the divine biune nature. The universe didn't expand outward into infinite cold space. It turned inward. It contained itself. Even the science was a sermon. This is also why celibacy was mandatory for the inner circle of the unity. The biune transformation. The merging of the masculine and feminine into a single immortal being could only happen if followers had already begun transcending the physical division between the sexes. Physical desire was the obstacle. To become a biune being, you first had to stop being only just one thing. Which makes the Chicago harem allegations, the Sidney Meyer lawsuit, that the women were induced to enter Teed's earthly harem, not just a scandal. It was a theological contradiction so severe it threatened the entire foundation of what he was teaching. He never really answered it directly. He never had to. The case didn't go to trial, and the followers who stayed chose to stay. Victoria Gracia, real name Annie Ordway, a married woman who joined the unity and was given a new name and a new identity by Teed himself. She wasn't just his companion. In his theology, she was his designated vessel. Her body was, in his words, his temple, the arch-natural womanhood of new dispensation, whatever that means. After his death, she told the gathered followers directly, and this account survives, that what happened wasn't yet theocrasis. He didn't yet pass into her. She said he'll return and shake hands with every one of us and do his work, and only then would theocrasis occur. Only then would she be endowed with divine power. She told them to wait and to trust. 5 days after Teed's death, with the body decomposing, the health inspector's order in hand, Victoria finally agreed that it was time. He was placed in a stone mausoleum on Estero Island. The community continued. Here's something almost no account of the Koresians mentions. Thomas Edison had a winter estate in Fort Myers. And Edison, the most famous inventor in the world, visited the Koreshan settlement more than once. He and his wife, Mina, they attended theatrical performances in the Koreshan Art Hall. On the 15th anniversary of the incandescent light bulb, the Edisons were caught at the settlement during a heavy storm and ended up sharing lunch with the community. Sit with that image for a minute. Thomas Edison eating lunch with people who believe that they were living on the inside of a hollow sphere. History is strange. The community dwindled through the teens and the 20s, slowly, but they held on. Then came October 1921, a hurricane. The mausoleum on Estero Island, where Teed was entombed, was destroyed. It was leveled. The storm took it apart stone by stone. Days later, 14 followers went to the beach to see what the water left behind. They found bones and a skull. One of the women, a follower named Evelyn, wrote a letter to her daughter describing what happened next. She wrote, "You can imagine how we felt, but she wasn't destroyed by it. She was steadied by something." Another woman recalled Teed once saying that he himself didn't know whether his bones would dissolve during theocrasis. So Evelyn wrote to her daughter, "We know that what happened is all right." They gathered the bones and put them in the Estero post office for safekeeping. The post office later burned down. The man who built an entire cosmology around physical immortality, who claimed the human body could be made indestructible, had his remains destroyed twice, first by a hurricane, then by fire. He ended up as a pile of ash in a Florida post office. By the 1940s, almost no one was left. A German refugee named Hedwig arrived at the settlement and became its de facto caretaker. She wasn't, by most accounts, a true believer. Now a descendant of the original Koreshans, later called her an interloper. In 1961, she arranged the transfer of the land to the state of Florida. The settlement became a state park. The archives went with it. The buildings are still standing, like the printing press, the auditorium, the grounds where they dug the irrigation channels by hand. And yes, the geodetic survey equipment, the rectilineator. It's all still there. Hedwig died. The College of Life Foundation, the legal shell that held the remaining Koreshan property, continued filing tax returns into the 2010s. No members, no believers, just paperwork. The last entry in a very long ledger. So let's go back to where it all started. December 22nd, 1908, Estero, Florida, the bathtub, the body, and the followers who wouldn't move. Here's a question I've been sitting with since I started researching the story. Did Cyrus Teed believe it? Not the followers of Victoria Gracia. I'm talking about him, because look at what this man actually built. Not the theology, but the infrastructure, the incorporation of Estero as a municipality, the political party with full county slate, the legal documents, the debt leveraged against Fort Myers merchants, the probationary agreements with no wage clauses, the printing press that never stopped running. These are the tools of a man who understood that belief alone doesn't hold territory. He built a theocracy designed to function without a theologian. He built a machine that would keep running after he was gone, whether he rose from the dead or not. Whether he believed his own doctrine, now that question died with him, and we don't get to know. What we do know is this. A farm boy from upstate New York told the world that it was living on the inside of a hollow sphere. He conducted physical surveys to prove it. He built a city in a Florida swamp and ran candidates for every office in the county. He threatened to destroy a town's economy over a pair of broken eyeglasses. And he died in a bathtub surrounded by people waiting for a cosmic transformation that never came. His bones washed out to sea. His skull burned in the post office. And today, you can walk around the grounds of his New Jerusalem. It's a state park with a gift shop. If you go, send me a card. I'm John Genoa. This has been America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.